Every time you shake a stranger's hand, you are repeating a piece of ancient choreography that may have been designed for one very specific purpose: to prove, in a single motion, that you were not about to kill them. It sounds dramatic for something so casual today, but the deeper you look into the history of this gesture, the stranger and older it becomes, stretching back long before handshakes meant business deals or polite hellos. The earliest surviving image of two people clasping right hands comes from a Mesopotamian relief carved in the 9th century before the Common Era. It shows the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III grasping hands with a Babylonian ruler, sealing an alliance between two powerful kingdoms. Some historians also point to an older, separate Mesopotamian tradition, in which a king would grasp the hands of a divine statue during a New Year ritual, symbolically receiving the authority to rule for another year. Whether or not these two customs are directly connected remains debated, but together they suggest that clasping hands as a symbol of trust, obligation, or transferred power was already meaningful in the region thousands of years ago. The gesture also appears throughout the oldest works of Greek literature. Homer described handshakes several times in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, almost always in moments involving a pledge or a display of trust between two people. By the 5th century before the Common Era, the Greeks had a specific word for it, dexiosis, meaning roughly to take the right hand. Historians offer more than one explanation for why the right hand specifically became so important. One widely repeated theory holds that extending an empty right hand, the hand most people use to hold a weapon, was a way of visibly proving you intended no harm. A related theory suggests that the brief up and down motion of a handshake may have originally served a more practical purpose, shaking loose any small blade hidden up a sleeve. Neither explanation can be confirmed with certainty, but both point toward the same underlying idea, that this gesture began as a small, physical proof of safety between two people who had reason to be cautious of each other. For the Greeks, dexiosis grew into something far larger than a simple greeting. It appeared on treaties between city-states, in marriage scenes symbolizing the joining of two families, and, most movingly, on funerary gravestones. These stone memorials often show a seated figure representing someone who had died, clasping hands with a standing family member. The gesture on these graves had nothing to do with weapons or diplomacy. It represented an unbroken bond, a farewell that suggested the connection between the living and the dead had not truly been severed. When Rome absorbed much of Greek culture, it absorbed this gesture as well, renaming it dextrarum iunctio, the joining of right hands. Roman coins frequently featured two clasped hands to represent loyalty, friendship, or a formal agreement between parties, and the same image appeared in Roman marriage ceremonies to represent the union between husband and wife. Across these ancient societies, separated by centuries and different languages, the same basic idea kept reappearing, that joining right hands was a way to make an invisible agreement suddenly visible. What is easy to assume, but historically inaccurate, is that the handshake continued on afterward as the default greeting across the Western world. For much of the medieval and early modern period in Europe, it was not. Formal greetings were far more likely to involve bowing, removing or tipping a hat, or, among the upper classes, kissing a hand, each gesture carefully calibrated to reflect the relative social rank of the two people involved. A nobleman bowed differently to a king than he did to a merchant. These gestures were not neutral. They were small, constant reminders of where everyone stood in a rigid social hierarchy. The handshake's return to everyday life is credited largely to a religious group in 17th-century England, the Quakers. Quakers held a distinctive belief that all people stood as equals before God, regardless of birth, wealth, or title. And they were famously unwilling to perform gestures that implied one person was socially beneath another. Bowing to a social superior, removing a hat in someone's presence, these were rejected outright. In their place, Quakers adopted the handshake as their standard greeting for everyone they met, from close family to complete strangers, because unlike a bow or a hat tip, a handshake required both people to do the exact same thing to each other at the exact same time. There was no higher or lower position built into the gesture itself. It was, by its very physical structure, an equalizing act. This idea proved remarkably persuasive well beyond Quaker communities. Over the following 2 centuries, the handshake gradually displaced the older, rank-based greetings across much of Western society. By the 19th century, etiquette manuals were treating a proper handshake as essential social knowledge, complete with detailed instructions about grip strength, how long to hold the clasp, and the correct moment to release. What had once been a gesture used mainly to prove someone was unarmed, and later a religious statement about human equality, had by this point become something else entirely. Ordinary daily etiquette, expected in business, in greetings between friends, and eventually in almost every formal introduction across much of the world. Even at the height of its popularity, the handshake was never quite as universal as it can feel today. In Japan, a bow has long remained the more common formal greeting, its depth and duration carrying its own precise social meaning. In parts of South and Southeast Asia, a slight bow with hands pressed together in front of the chest served, and in many places still serves, the same basic social function. Even within cultures that did widely adopt handshaking, customs around which hand to use, how firm a grip should be, and whether it was appropriate between men and women varied considerably from region to region. The handshake's spread across much of the world was less a single, universal human instinct and more a specific cultural habit, carried outward through trade, colonization, and international business, until it came to feel, to many, like the only natural way to greet a stranger. For most of the 20th century, that felt permanent. The handshake had become so deeply embedded in daily social life that most people who performed it several times a day never paused to wonder where it came from, or why the right hand, specifically, still mattered. Then, within the span of a few weeks in the early months of a global pandemic, one of humanity's oldest surviving gestures was suddenly treated as a health risk rather than a courtesy. Health officials around the world openly discouraged it. People experimented instead with elbow bumps, small waves, or simply a nod, searching for some substitute that could convey the same instant signal of goodwill without direct physical contact. Years later, the handshake has largely returned, though perhaps slightly less automatic than it once was. Its place in daily life no longer entirely taken for granted. Some workplaces still favor a nod or a wave over direct contact, and the brief hesitation before offering a hand, a small pause that essentially did not exist before the pandemic, has itself become a quiet, modern addition to a very old ritual. What this long, winding history really reveals is not simply how one gesture managed to survive for nearly 3,000 years, changing hands, cultures, and meanings along the way, but how consistently humans have reached for some small physical act, an empty hand extended, a grip held for a moment, to say something words alone have never quite managed to say as quickly or as convincingly, that in this moment, between us, there is nothing to fear.